No, I mean, architecture is political. We gotta add that stuff.
Indeed.
We're tearing down communities to build multifamily, and you have to understand we are creating displacement. You're displacing Black and brown folks, and they don't come back.
Half of this podcast would be dedicated to the history of Tyler House, my journey and my discoveries, and hey, I'm going to solve this housing problem.
Hey guys, what's up? My name is Melissa Daniels. This is the Architecturalist Political Podcast where Black and brown folks talk about architecture. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and be part of my storytelling. I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface of social housing. During my tenure in college was not taught. And I have to seek out more information on it because it's not in my purview. Even though I am part of the AIA Housing and Community Development Knowledge Community, and thank you for the individuals who are part of the group who are in that world, and learning more and more about social housing gets me really excited. And talking to Jonathan about his book, Homes for Living, and just reading through it and doing a deep dive into how it all works. And we all know about public housing, and then you have this social housing, and then you have co-ops, limited equity cooperatives. It's all technical, and not a lot of people know about housing policy. They just know I can't afford where I live. And Jonathan does a really good job in educating you, as well as the human aspect of the people who are actually affected by these policies. When real world situations where privatization comes in, what do? Do you try to make some money like the good capitalist American does? Or do you believe in a social program where here you are able to afford where you live? And there's some caveats to that, fortunately and maybe unfortunately. I learned about Mitchell-Lama, which I didn't know because I'm not a New Yorker. Jonathan uses interviews, historical context, and really sheds light on the social, economic, and racial dynamics that influences public and affordable housing. So I hope you enjoyed this interview. We just scratched the surface of what was in the book. So I highly recommend that you read it. So how did I come across this book? I just want to say real quickly, I get solicitations of individuals who want to come on the podcast. And I normally say no. But again, being a member of AIA's Housing and Community Development, one of the committee members knows Jonathan. And so when the publisher approached me, I was like, oh, I heard of this guy. And I asked for a copy of the book in PDF form, and the person sent it to me. And it was like, oh, I like this. This is pretty good. So he came on. And if I didn't like this book, then I would have said, yeah, I'm not going to do this. So I say all that to say that I was not paid to have this interview at all, and it educated me. So I hope you listen to it and enjoy it. So here you go. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you today?
I am good for this evening, considering the state of our world.
Yes, always a good caveat right now.
So do you live in DC?
I do live in DC. I'm relatively new to DC, but I am here.
Okay. How long you been here?
I've been here about 10 months, so it feels about 4 or less. Yeah.
What brings you here?
family and work. My in-laws live in Northern Virginia, and my partner and I were moving back to the US from Nairobi, and
Wow,
it's
wow.
good, close to that. So yeah,
How long were you in Nairobi?
we
Forget the book. Let's talk about you see.
we were there for about 2.5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What were you doing?
Well, I was writing this book. We were there for my wife's work, which is focused on water and sanitation. But my work is very much focused on the US and housing and planning and economic development. And being in Nairobi allowed me some space and time to actually write this thing. So that worked out in an ironic way.
Only reason why we're here is that you wrote a book and you've been doing book tours. How has that been?
That's been fun. I mean, it's really edifying after kind of working on this project for off and on a decade to be sharing these stories with folks. And as no surprise to any listener, this podcast, our housing crises are getting worse and worse. And so there is a lot of interest around housing topics generally and social housing models in particular. And so it's great to have those conversations with people in person, hear that response.
So I got a copy of it. I don't know what's on the back of it, but what I'm reading is from your website. I don't know if this changed, but be happy to correct me. All
Yeah.
right. The American dream of homeownership is becoming an American delusion. As renters seek an escape from record-breaking rent hikes, first-time home buyers find that skyrocketing interest rates and historically low inventory leave them with scant options for an affordable place to live. With home valued more than ever as a commodity, even social housing programs meant to insulate families from cutthroat markets are under threat, sometimes by residents themselves. In Homes for Living, The Fight for Social Housing and a New American Commons, urban planner and oral historian Jonathan Tartan introduces readers to two social housing co-ops in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and that's in New York, if you didn't know. Longtime residents of St. James Towers and Southbridge Towers lock horns over whether to maintain the rules that have kept their homes affordable for decades, or to cash out at great personal profit, thereby denying future generations the same opportunity to build thriving communities rooted in mutual care. All right, so why did you write this book? What was the motivation? And why the fight for social housing? I mean, that's in the title.
Yeah. So the genesis of the book was I was working as a journalist in New York over a decade ago, and a resident of one of these cooperatives came to me in my publication and said, "I'm concerned about the direction of this co-op. I would like to cover this." And so I started kind of to dig into these stories, which, as you were just reading, kind of center on these two very large affordable housing cooperatives in New York City that are great examples of permanently affordable places to live for middle and low income folks that were built that way and intended to stay that way in perpetuity. But through kind of a controversial loophole, the residents themselves could vote to quote unquote privatize, which meant removing a restriction on the resale value of their share, essentially of their apartment. That same restriction is what kept these places affordable to folks. So, people could still buy into some of these co-ops today in New York City for as little as $45,000. And you can imagine that's a decent price for a place in lower Manhattan. One would say quite a deal. But if that resale restriction goes away, that same thing could be sold for $1 million. So these are dramas. These fights. The reason I say fight is because, well, there's two reasons to say fight. One is that the debates within these co-ops about whether or not to privatize are fights. They are cutthroat. People who have been living together for years. These are very tight-knit communities. They often have, some cases, 3 generations of family living in these buildings, in these developments. are kind of split apart. And so they are, fighting over essentially what their housing means, who it should be for, what housing is for, whether it's about profiting, being able to sell for, quote unquote, whatever the market will bear, or if it's about maintaining that housing for future generations to be able to access it. So that's one sense of the word fight, is the actual debates in these communities. The other one is that our broader housing system, these sorts of models, these social housing models, I mean, it's always been a fight to get them in place. It's always been a fight to ensure that everyone has a place to call home, and a safe, stable, affordable place to call home. And that fight continues today. And so I think these stories are, in many ways, sort of a microcosm of much larger housing fights that are ongoing, not just for homeowners, but also for renters. And yeah, as I dug further and further into these debates through, deep interviews with residents following this over many years, it also just became more and more clear how rich the stories were and how much there was going on beyond profit. I mean, you can't take that out of the equation. That is certainly a central thing here, but there are so many aspects to what people are really arguing about, including self-determination, including reparations, including, in some cases, folks' desire to discriminate, and just simply needing money to take care of their families. That is all bound up in these stories, and I found it a really endlessly generative thing to learn about.
It's interesting how you in the book how you just marry a lot of these things, policy, politics, drama, all into this. So, what's the difference then from a co-op to like social housing? Like, what is a cooperative?
Yeah, it's a great question. Social housing is kind of a big umbrella term. For me, and definitions of this, different people have different definitions. For me, social housing is permanently affordable housing that is kept so by being kept outside of the market. So it's decommodified in some way. Its value is not fluctuating dramatically just based on, what someone will pay for it. And in social housing, residents have some sort of say in their home. So co-ops, or in this case, limited equity co-ops, these are the kinds of co-ops that I'm talking about in the book, are a form of social housing. Not all co-ops are. So a cooperative is really it's a housing situation in which a company, you literally have like an LLC owns a building. In order for someone to have access to an apartment in that building, they own a share. So in the same way you might own a share in like Apple, these folks own a share in St. James LLC, and that share entitles them to an apartment in that building and also a vote on governance matters in the building. So they elect folks to their co-op board. That co-op board manages the finances. They hire and fire the property management. They make all the big decisions about what goes on in the life of that building. Other forms of social housing, in addition to limited equity co-ops, are public housing in the US. That's probably the, biggest form of social housing by just pure numbers in the United States. Community land trusts are another common form of social housing. But yeah, so co-ops can be a form of social housing. They aren't always, I would say. Yeah.
So, one of the things that brought these two communities together, St. James and Southbridge, is two senators back in the day. And one thing that I do want to, and I've always said this to my audience, that the affordable housing crisis is not new at all. And even in the 50s and 60s, they were trying to find solutions. So if you could just talk about Mitchell-Lama and how these two senators created this.
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So, yeah, Mitchell and Lama, they were, two legislators, New York State legislators, who were the sponsors of the bill, which is technically called the Limited Profit Housing Companies Act of 1955 that underlay this larger program, which, is now colloquially in the city known as Mitchell-Lama today. As you're saying, I so appreciate the flag that, these issues are not new. So this program it was a response to a housing crisis post-war. So, there were folks coming back from overseas, often veterans. There was a real housing crunch. There was a deep concern that there were plenty of people who were not poor enough to qualify for public housing, but they were not well off enough to afford homes on the quote unquote market. So this program, which built both rental and co-op units, was intended to fill that gap. It was also intended to try to keep middle income folks, particularly middle income white folks in the city at a time of growing suburbs, a lot of financing of white families to buy homes in those suburbs and locking out black families from the same. So that was sort of the genesis of this program. And it ended up being, by all accounts, very successful. It built almost 140,000 apartments in New York City alone, including, and there were others outside of New York City and New York State. Half of those were co-ops, half of those were rental apartments. And these places also grew. I like to say that they both fulfilled their intent and also subverted some of that intent. So for example, this was also a time of new fair housing law in the US. And this was a program that, for the first time, a lot of Black New Yorkers and other New Yorkers of color were able to access this housing in a way that was less restrictive than in previous years. So that's one way in which, St. James Towers becomes like a very thriving Black middle income community when the actual creators of the program never intended that. And those families, a number of them, came to this building because of discrimination in the housing market outside of that. So there's one current resident of the building who she's now in her 80s, Winna, but her dad was actually an architect on the building and never wanted his family to live there. But they ended up putting down a deposit for an apartment there because they tried to buy land in the Bronx. When the seller found out her father was Black, they pulled out of the deal. And this was the Mitchell-Lama co-op at St. James Towers became a kind of way to be insulated somewhat from that racist market.
So I want to get into these two communities, Southbridge, which is in Lower Manhattan, and St. James, which is in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Talk about both of these communities. They're so different. They're so in line of where they at in New York.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'll just start with St. James because I was just talking about it. So yeah, St. James is located in Stuyvesant or Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, which is a historically Black neighborhood and known as such. And a lot of the folks who moved into St. James lived in the neighborhood at the time when it was being built.
Can you also describe because there's also architects here, so just
Okay, yeah. You got it. So I'll say that both of these developments were built in urban renewal areas. And so in the case of St. James, this was the Pratt Institute urban renewal area. So it was really clearing row homes, a big swath of this neighborhood in order to make additional space for a university. And what they saw as the, predominantly white middle income folks who would come and work there. And so St. James is 326 apartments. It's built, I liken it to a domino, in part because it was built along with two other co-ops that are identical to it in a row. So there are these three towers. They're each about, I think, 24 stories that are just dominoes. They're just a rectangle kind of, extruded into the air. St. James doesn't have much in it beyond apartments. It has a small community room. It's set back off Lafayette Avenue. It has a playground. It's a somewhat classic tower in the park, but not a lot going on other than that. in terms of the building itself. Southbridge is quite different, as you say. It is much larger. It is about, I think it's 1,362 units. It's spread across 6 different buildings that are all kind of built around a series of courtyards. It too was a product of an urban renewal area, which was designed to kind of build a civic center in Lower Manhattan. And so other things that are part, Pace University was built, was expanded as part of this. There are government buildings that were expanded as part of this. But this was an area that was deeply commercial when that land was being cleared. So this was a rare residential outpost in Lower Manhattan, and the design really reflects that. The neighborhood kind of shut down after 5 p.m. And so where were the folks who were going to be living at Southbridge go? Like, where would they get their food? It all had to sort of be built into the structures themselves. So in these courtyards, you have grocery stores, you have bars, you have diner, you have a vet, you had a laundry, but it was all oriented internally. So it sort of saw itself as an outpost in the city in Lower Manhattan, and it sort of turns inward from the neighborhood and is less so integrated with the larger neighborhood. In the case of St. James, in just being sort of like a tower sitting in the middle of this neighborhood, it in some sense was more integrated with the wider neighborhood because, well, all of the amenities weren't built into the building itself. People were already living in the neighborhood nearby. They were, connected with their neighbors in that way.
Now we're going to get into like the people and the politics a
Yeah.
little bit. And like I mentioned before, you were able to do like a bit of storytelling. I
Mhm.
guess that's part of your oral histories, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
just sitting down and just listening to people.
Yeah.
My own personal question is when you sat down and talked to these people, getting their histories, was there any surprises along the way, right? You mentioned Winona, and then there's other characters on both ends.
Yeah. So, I mean, what was really interesting to me was when I first encountered this, what drew me in was, oh, well, you have these debates. On the grand scheme of things, you have millions and millions of dollars at issue here. You have folks deciding kind of the future of whether to maintain this housing that's really built as a public good as such, or whether to privatize it and themselves, profit from that. And I was really compelled by the fact that, like, these were such intense fights that there was, many people would look at this on its face and say, like, oh, these people could make this amount of money by privatizing. Like, this is a foregone conclusion, right? And many people would just say, like, oh, this fight is done. But it wasn't by any means. And so, like, I wanted to understand how people were making their decisions. Like, what were these debates actually about? Because it was obviously more than just money. One thing that I found really interesting that I did not expect was very quickly in many of these conversations, almost like the literal definition of like what is ownership kept coming up. And I didn't think this was going to be at issue. I said, these people are shareholders. They own their homes. They get to, they're literally in a process to make a very, very big decision about their homes. These folks are owners, they definitely not renters. But it became very clear to me as I talked to more people that there are a few different perspectives on what ownership meant. So among folks who did really want to remove this restriction on their ability to profit from their home, they saw their inability to profit as making this not true ownership. That true home ownership means profit. And I mean, we know this, like, we know this from 2008. We know this from a long history that ownership of housing does not always result in profit. I mean, that's what, is often, talked about. We talk about like home ownership as a way of wealth building. Like that's a very common conversation, but almost as equally, it's often been a case of folks losing money as well. But it was very interesting, this idea that like, if we cannot profit from our homes, then we don't really own it. And that is very much tied up with, being an owner, achieving home ownership is so directly tied with this idea of the American dream that there were many people who did not see, they thought they would not even really become true citizens, quote unquote, of the US without their ability to profit from home. And that strain of argument was very strong among one subset of Black cooperators at St. James, where the idea of profiting from this and being true homeowners was very much tied to an idea of self-determination. And that's something that, even though in the book it's very clear, like, I have a viewpoint here, I don't think privatization is a good thing. So I don't agree with that necessarily, but I think it's an argument that I find, it's a very compelling argument. It's something that I have great empathy for. There is also a strong alternative way of thinking about ownership, which is that instead of it being about having a right to something, like, oh, ownership being the right to profit from this housing, as some folks would say, there were other folks who saw ownership entailing a responsibility. That they say, we own this housing that has been continually funded by the public through government to be permanently affordable, to be a resource to us and future generations. And because we are owners of that, that means we have the responsibility to steward that and to maintain it as such. And so, yeah, coming into this, I didn't really think this was a story about, like, what does ownership mean? But it, like, quickly revealed itself to be that. I mean, it just gets to, like, how central those ideas are, and, how we think about home, but also wealth and citizenship in the US.
That's interesting. So, how did the topic of privatization come up with each of these communities? Because they signed a paper, they knew what they were getting themselves into, right?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So this possibility, so I mentioned earlier, in that original law, shepherded by Mitchell-Lama, the possibility of this privatization was not even there. It did not exist. But in an effort to actually spur more rental construction under the law, this was added later on, years later. So it was the economics of developing rental housing and developing co-op housing are very different, in part because in the co-op sense, the residents own the building. In the rental sense, a developer or other owner owns everything. And so the ability to privatize for a rental development would actually be an incentive for those developers that owned it to build more. I mean, it's the same way that a lot of affordable housing works now. It's like, after 15 to 30 years, the restrictions on the rents go away, and then folks rake in the dough. So that was an attempt by legislators to spur more rental development that then was misapplied to co-ops. The same incentive does not apply to co-ops. So it didn't really make sense. But this misapplication, it kind of enters it is really interesting how it kind of gets to cooperators, how people even, like, realize this is a possibility. It happens in part because, well, the rule is once you pay off your mortgage, once the co-op pays off its mortgage, which was funded initially by the city or the state, they can then go through this process of voting about whether to remove this resale restriction or not. There's a lot of money to be made here, obviously not just by the residents themselves, but this is a process that is highly, highly technical. And so it also requires accountants. It requires tons of lawyers. Yeah, there's a kind of cottage industry around these things that mean that people start to feed information to cooperators to say, hey, you can do this, you can do this. And there's a real estate industry that also, stands to benefit from this as well. It's like, once these things are no longer operating how they currently do, which is, oh, well, if someone wants to leave, they sell their share back to the co-op. That share then goes to the next person on the wait list. And that wait list is very long. It's, publicly administered. It is, once that goes away, if it privatizes and the wait list gets scrapped, then, these are being sold by real estate agents. Like, there's it just, like, enters the kind of general, very commodified way that real estate operates in New York City. So this stuff is in the ether. Like you can go online and there are blog posts everywhere about like Mitchell-Lama. First, how do you get into them? Like when can they privatize? All of this stuff. So it's out there. These debates also often stretch for many, many years. So for example, at Southbridge Towers, the kind of debates I covered in the book, they stretch over a decade. But that's only one instances of them. Like this first, the idea of privatization at Southbridge actually came up in the 90s and was beaten back. But once it's sort of there, it's really hard to put to bed because there's always going to be a subset of this community who see that possible upside of profit and like will stick with it and they'll come again and they'll come again. And I mean, it's like I said, it's very technical and it kind of takes over the life of the co-op. So, at Southbridge Towers, every year when they would have board elections, there were literally like small political parties operating within this co-op. You keep in mind that, there are over 1,300 apartments there. There were over 4,000 people living there. Like there were dueling parties of a sort who would run slates of candidates. And like the qualification was you're either for privatization or you're against it. And like, so because that becomes the lens through which all co-op matters are seen, like literally everything is seen through, well, will this stop us from privatizing? Will this help us towards this? And so it's all consuming in that regard.
North Capitol and New York Avenue.
Mhm.
There's a building called Tower House. Across from Tower House, there's Sursum Quarter. They were a co-op. Are you familiar with that?
I have been told about Sursum Corda in this process.
What? What did you hear? Or what did you know about them?
So what I heard was that, they were developed as a co-op kind of coming out of urban renewal. Folks who have been displaced by an urban renewal project, rehoused in this co-op, that over time buildings weren't properly maintained and that residents then had, essentially this choice of whether to maintain it as a co-op or I believe to, get Section 8 vouchers and for the place to be redeveloped. And that folks voted to do so to opt for that. But that's the I'm sure there's much more to the story, but those are the spark notes that I was given by another DC person.
Correct. So when I was going through this, that kept coming in my mind, and I was thinking about St. James and it being in this Black neighborhood, and I was like, well, how do one of the things that I think what was detrimental with Thurston Quarter is you had people who never ran property before.
Yep.
And so you're like, okay, well, there's management that would take advantage of people were stealing monies, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Did you come across anything like that? I'm pretty sure you did.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. So I didn't come across that at St. James. I mean, there are certainly other co-ops in that are under this Mitchell-Lama program in New York City that struggle. I think there are in many cases there are allegations of like corruption in many different co-ops. There's allegations of like people jumping up the wait list by like slipping some money under the table. There's different co-ops are better run than others. But what you're pointing to is like, I think a really important note with these co-ops is that one, running them is a lot of work and they require a lot of, in some cases, like, they not only require a lot of time, there are folks who are coming into this who, for good reason, are not well skilled at running a very, very large, complicated building. And they're not supposed to be. Like, that's not their jobs. They have their whole lives to attend to. What I think is, in some ways, a very important aspect of this program in New York is that there are other forms of support for these co-ops. So, like, many people have very varied feelings about their relationship to the city and state housing agencies, but those housing agencies are still involved. They're still involved with these co-ops, trying to ensure that they are well run and financially sound and that the housing remains of good quality. That being said, like they still, I think a lot of these folks still need additional support. Southbridge and St. James are both like they're kind of stars of the program in some regard. They're like in great shape. They're in great shape financially. They're in good physical condition. But that's not always the case for other co-ops in the city and under this program. And I don't think that should strictly be up to the residents. I think like whether it's through government, whether it's through nonprofits, like people need additional support when managing these things because of precisely the things that you're mentioning. That I tend to think people are very well adept to make good decisions about their homes when they're well resourced to do so and when they have the information they need to do that. That doesn't mean that they should be experts in building finance. It just means that they need, the support from others and the information to make those good decisions.
How do you feel? What's your personal opinion about this program, about Mitchell-Lama?
One of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that I think it's a huge success. I think the big challenge with it is this privatization loophole that frankly should have never existed. That's why we have these debates today. But otherwise, I think Mitchell-Lama is one of the best examples we have in the US of large scale successful social housing that has not been, as public housing has been defunded over the years and been crippled by austerity, more or less. So I think it is a very helpful model to look to as social housing is entering more and more housing conversations across the US, not just New York, not just DC. I have like a little Google alert for, limited equity co-ops, and you'd be surprised all the places across the country that are looking at these models and trying to implement them. And so I think I think it's an important, show that this isn't foreign to the US, that this sort of decommodified housing, it's possible to do, and we have models to show that it can be successful. And two, we also have a model to look at that has been in operation for over 60 years, and we can see what has not gone well. And we can actually shape that. So one of the things I like to talk about, you know, the very fact that privatization was even possible in these co-ops is a good marker that say, oh, well, you can pass a law now, but laws change. As we know, administrations change, norms disappear. And in order for our models to be really resilient to those shifts, we need more than just legal backstops. We also need sort of the social backstops to this. And I like to talk about it in a form of like essentially a social maintenance. So, we talk about the physical maintenance of buildings. We talk about the financial maintenance. They need to be, capitalized properly in order to take care of those physical properties. But especially for social housing like this, that is built with a particular public purpose in mind and with this decommodified aspect to it that runs contrary to the larger, real estate environment in the US. In order for that to be maintained, the sort of social backing of that idea has to be reaffirmed. So, you see this over the years in Mitchell-Lama program. It's like, the folks who moved in at the beginning totally got it. Like, it was just like, yes, a part of our role is not just to live here and then build this community together. It's also to make sure that the next family can take advantage of what we've been able to take advantage of. And that it disappears down, it doesn't disappear, but it lessens over the years, and that messaging kind of disappears. It disappears from the city and the state. They don't talk about the kind of true value or purpose of the program. They mainly talk about finances when they're arguing for how to maintain these. And you see that among residents themselves, that like talking about the ethical questions at play in these privatization battles becomes quote unquote ideological, as if like the idea of privatizing isn't also ideological. So I think that, that idea of making sure that we're thinking about the social maintenance of these sorts of buildings over time is really important as well. But I think it's a really successful program. I think there's a lot to learn from it. And yeah, I would love to see more like it, frankly.
In your list of limited equity co-ops, is there any in DC or in the DMV?
Yeah. So there are a number of co-ops that have come out of the Tenant Opportunity for Purchase Act. So these are rental buildings that are being sold by their owner In DC, residents have kind of a collective right of first refusal to buy that building together and potentially turn it into a co-op. That's hard to do for obvious reasons. You have to raise money to buy a rental building. These are folks who are renting for a reason.
Right.
They are not flush with cash to be able to buy this together. But there are different nonprofits and in some cases city funding available to allow for that. So there are co-ops that have come out of that. There's an excellent book by an urban geographer, also professor at UDC, Amanda Huron, called Carving Out the Commons, that is specifically about limited equity co-ops in DC. The distinction between the ones here and like those in New York coming out of this Mitchell-Lama program is really scale. So some of these co-ops in New York, they're quite big. They're 1,400 units, and they were developed as co-op housing with the backing of the city and the state. Many of the co-ops in DC, even the big ones, are probably, I've heard, like max 100 units, and that's very large for this. So like when you're even talking about, you were talking about capacity earlier, about like, folks being able to have the internal capacity to run these together. In some ways, scale is actually like it helps you out. There's more people to spread the work around. And, there's not just more people within the co-op. The Mitchell-Lama co-ops in New York also have the benefit of just more city and state involvement and more capacity at that level as well. So there are examples in DC, but they're more kind of fragmented. They're smaller, they're less well-resourced, and for that reason, kind of harder to maintain.
I think that's the sweet spot right there is the size. Again, you mentioned spreading the responsibilities. One of the things I was thinking about too in terms of privatization is you're going to have people who want to come in and come out. I don't want to participate in anything at all. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to, just leave me alone. So when you have a larger number of units, larger, families or people living in those units, you tend to have more of a balance than a smaller, and you have a larger group of people who don't want to do anything, who just want to live their lives, leave me alone, and complain about why is this broken or how come, this looks like crap, let's go and paint it, but no one wants to pay any fees or anything like that. So yeah, I think size is really, really important. One of the questions I have here is, okay, the desire for wealth accumulation through homeownership is a powerful motivator for privatization. How does this desire relate to historical or ongoing disparities in wealth building opportunities for the Black and Brown communities?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. As I mentioned earlier, there was an argument among certain Black cooperators at St. James that being able to profit from this housing by privatizing was almost a form of reparations, that they had been locked out of wealth building opportunities in a racist market, and that not allowing them to profit from this housing as well was essentially the same thing, and that they deserve to build wealth through selling at a profit in this housing. There are a couple things happening here. One is that we have this idea that wealth is built through housing by appreciation. That like you buy a house, it costs this amount, a small amount here, and then 15 years later, the value has increased tremendously. And if you sell, that's how you build wealth. The folks in these co-ops build wealth in a different way, but they're still building wealth. So what many advocates would say is that, we get our benefits up front. They buy in. It's very, some of these folks bought in for like $3,000 in the 1970s. They are able to stably own a home for a low cost. Their ongoing housing costs are very reasonable. So they're saving. What they're doing is they're saving on a monthly basis. And you have situations in a number of these co-ops. When I mentioned earlier, like she has a second home. She worked at Einstein Hospital in the Bronx for a very long time in labor and delivery, and she was able to save by having a very accessible form of housing that was reasonably priced and affordable. And So that's how she built wealth. She didn't build wealth by waiting for her share in this co-op to be worth $1 million. So one of the conversations I hear a lot these days is, well, much of the white middle class and the wealth of the white middle class was built through home ownership. And that home ownership was that wealth, that building of wealth was predicated on exclusion. It was predicated on the exclusion of Black and brown communities from that same benefit. So there is a discussion of saying, well, like, how are Black and brown families supposed to build wealth now? They point to a similar mechanism. They're saying, well, like the white middle class was built through home ownership. Is this the mechanism by which, we can build wealth today? I think it's a tricky thing because I do think that building wealth through home ownership almost implies that someone has to lose, especially if it's through that appreciation mechanism, because it's two sides of one coin, right? On one side, it's like, oh, my house is now worth way more than it used to be. The other side of that coin is someone can't afford to live here. Like the other side of that coin is housing unaffordability. That's why, in fact, I like to talk about these models because it's not, the way people build wealth is not through selling home as a commodity. It's by having some place that's affordable and that people can stay and save over a long period of time. And so I think it's a more, frankly, like a more inclusive way of building wealth and a more sustainable way of building wealth than more commodity-based home ownership. That being said, I think the arguments that Black families want to be able to profit from their home because they have been locked out of doing so for decades and decades and decades, I can't argue with that. That makes complete sense. So I'll leave it there.
It's funny because it's like you probably heard of this, right? Like there was like this couple who was trying to sell their home and they took out any evidence of them being Black and their appraisal value went up. So anything that Black people have owned as just seemed to be devalued. And then in the flip side of sense, so if any of these residents wants to move, where are they going to move to? Because they can't afford to go any other place.
Yeah.
So even if they sell their unit for $44,000, same thing with that happened at Surgeon Quarter. They offered the residents $90,000 for their prime real estate. And it's like, where do you go for $90,000? And how do they handle that large sum of money? That's another thing. So many layers to this. So it's very complicated, as you mentioned. It's not just a cut dry thing, but you have all these other factors that's in it. In the epilogue, you suggested that the fight for social housing continues. What gives you hope for the future, Jonathan? What can we hope?
Hope, we need it. Uh, so I mentioned earlier, like seeing these models pop up in places that I would not expect them to be in the public conversation. I think that actually gives me hope. I think it's, again, kind of two sides of a coin. Our housing crises are now so severe that people are looking to models that they wouldn't otherwise for answers. I think, the idea that we're simply going to build our way out of this, or that, yeah, with that, oh, this is the market will readjust, that the rents will come down. I think people are rightfully completely mistrustful of those arguments, and that our crises are so severe that these kinds of models are on the table. I see them popping up across the country, even if you look at different political races across the country. I mean, obviously I follow New York City politics because of this book, but social housing is a huge, huge portion of the arguments around who's going to be the next mayor of New York City. So I see more and more possibility for large scale programs of this nature to be passed in the coming years. I think a major challenge is how is it going to be funded, especially with a federal government that is completely antithetical to every sort of value that is embedded into social housing. But that being said, this Mitchell-Lama program, that was city and state funded. So it was, especially in some of different parts of the country, this can be pushed forward at a local level. So the more that I hear about community land trusts and limited equity co-ops, that gives me hope that these models are gaining steam. And I do draw hope, in the latter part of the book, I kind of get out of New York and I get out of just talking about these two co-ops. And one of the places I went to was Kansas City, Missouri, to talk with folks there who are part of KC Tenants, which is a really, really impressive tenants union. And I gather hope from the fact that there are tenants unions across the country probably have more power right now than they have in, the last 20, 30 years. And there's a renewed national tenants union, which is sort of a coalition of, big city-based unions across the country. And I think that's, they are in many ways they're some of the biggest proponents of social housing across the US, and they're pushing that forward on a local level. So those are things that give me hope. I mean, just a few weeks ago, Seattle funded, a public development arm to build social housing through a big, tax on wealthy individuals. And that gives me hope. So there are glimmers amidst the destruction. But yeah.
Yeah, it's really localized at this point, right? We have to stay in our cities and really make that change. Any key takeaways that you want the reader to get, or just buy my book?
I mean, if so compelled, feel free. Love that. But I start the book kind of making an argument that, housing is this public good. It needs to be treated as such. It needs to be treated as more than just a commodity.
It's a human right.
Yeah, and that it's infrastructure. That
Yeah.
this is fundamental, not just individualized, but how society functions. And I often say, the best mark of good infrastructure is if it fades into the background. Like, you may want your bridge to be pretty, but you don't want to be thinking about the inner workings of the bridge when you're driving across it. Like, if it's boring, it's probably good. And that's sort of my, hope for housing is it'd be way more banal, way less of a story than it is right now. And honestly, I think the only way to get there is to decommodify it. And we can't rely on it as the all-purpose way of funding college for kids, elder care, what have you, and the sole mechanism by which people can build wealth in this country.
Cash grab. It can't be a cash grab. Yeah.
Exactly. It can't serve all of those purposes and be affordable to folks. That just doesn't go together. And so the more we can kind of get behind these models, I think the better.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks for tuning in to Architecture's Political Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and found it informative or at least entertaining. If you like what you heard, please share with others. You can also connect with Arcus Poly on social media, currently on Instagram as well as Facebook and Twitter. For more information, visit us on our website. It's arcuspoly.online, ARCHIPOLLY.online. I also want to thank our loyal supporters who have been with this podcast for at least 3 years. It means the world to me, and I'm totally grateful to have you part of this community. I will try to bring you the best content as possible, and I can't wait to share more amazing episodes with you. If this is your first time listening, or just like a particular episode, or all of them, you can support this podcast by going on glow.fm/ArcusPoly. Again, thank you for your support. It means the world to me, and thank you so much for listening.